guys, welcome to Kubernetes for Beginners, our series of Kubernetes for Beginners. So today we are going to try to understand what is a Kubernetes manifest. In our previous video, we talked about Kubernetes manifest as just an instruction that Kubernetes use to actually fulfill the requirement, right? Just an instruction that we supply to Kubernetes. And Kubernetes will go ahead and read that instruction and do exactly what we ask him to do. Now, let's talk about understanding that manifest. So there are major part of that manifest that we need to understand so that it will be easy for us to go ahead and write those instructions. So let's jump into the topic. Now, imagine, imagine that we are trying to send an instruction to Kubernetes. So Kubernetes and that will go inform the manifest. But inside the manifest, there are important area and mandatory area that you need to know, and I will give you guys a layman description of what it means. For example, the first element in the manifest is an API version. So you see here, you say API version. So the API version specifies the version of the Kubernetes API being of the resource. Remember, we have the API, we have the resource version, the API, the API resource, for example. It can be a deployment, it can be a service, it can be a stateful set, for example. So when we say API version, we are actually talking about a version of the element that we are trying to create. And those API versions are being controlled by Kubernetes, right? Those API versions are being controlled by Kubernetes. If you want to know the API version of a specific API resource that you are trying to create, you can just go to your cluster and type kubectl API resources. It will show you. So the API version here is specify the version of the Kubernetes API being used, and it starts with small a and end up with and have capital V. Now the second element is the kind, right? The kind define the type of Kubernetes resources being created. So for example, let's imagine let's imagine this as if I'm cooking rice. If I want to cook rice, the first thing I need to do, I need to know the type of rice I want to cook. Is it a white rice? Let's say beans. I'm cooking beans. I want to cook beans. The first thing to know is the type of beans I want to cook. I want to cook. Is it a white beans? Is it a green bean? Is it a black bean? So the color of the bean will be like the API version, for example. The second one is going to be the kind, right? For example, the second one is going to be the kind. So the kind will actually tell me, is it like a beans that are like big beans, small beans, for example? That will be the kind. So the kind is just basically the name of the API resource you are trying to actually create, right? The API version set the versions, and the kind is actually the name of the resource that you are, the type of resource that you are trying to create. And another one here is going to be the metadata. Now, the metadata is actually the part that contains the name of the resource that you are trying to create, right? So the metadata contains the name of the resource you are trying to create. So far, the API version set the version of the element you are trying to create, the kind, tell Kubernetes what element you are trying to create, and the metadata tell Kubernetes the name of the element you are trying to create. So that's why I would say we are using app v1 as the API versions for the deployment that we are trying to create, and the name of that deployment is going to be my app deployment. Now, the third part is a specific spec. Spec stands for specification, right? So the spec section allows the desired configuration or property of the Kubernetes resource being created. So the spec just has specification. This is where you define, you put specification of what you are trying to create. So API version, set the version of the resource you are trying, the API resource you are trying to create. The kind actually tell Kubernetes the type of API version API resource you are trying to create. The metadata actually tell Kubernetes the name of the API resource, and the spec actually tell Kubernetes the specification of the API resource, for example, you are trying to create. So under spec, you always have stuff like replica for deployment, which is going to tell you the number of replica. For example, you have stuff like container, the image, the container name, the port that will be used. So that is what goes under the Kubernetes manifest. You always have API version, kind, metadata, and spec. Right? So simple, API version, kind, metadata, and spec, and every single of those elements represents something really specific. I hope you like this video. See you guys on the next video.